by thanking all of you for coming along here this evening. My name's Daniel Johnston, I'm the Labour MSP for Edinburgh Southern, and I'll just begin by introducing this event and what we have in front of us this evening. So, as you are all no doubt aware, this country is facing one of the biggest constitutional crises that it has faced, certainly in any of our lifetimes, but probably within the history of the United Kingdom itself. And Ian and I felt it's very important that as your elected representatives, that we put forward what our views are and how we seek to represent the interests of this constituency in Parliament and the wider political debate. So this evening that is what we are hoping to do, because we have a particular and very clear point of view, which is that, quite simply, borders don't solve problems, they create problems. And that's the perspective we bring to the Brexit debate. And that is why we believe that not only do we need to put a stop to a hard Brexit, which will destroy jobs and livelihoods, but we must also seek to put an end to the Brexit crisis itself, which is why both of us have long adhered to the view that we must have a second referendum to put back the choice to the people, and we would both be campaigning for Remain in that referendum. So this evening, we have a panel of guests. We will be beginning with an opening keynote speaker. We have a panel of guests who provide a range of expert views on the situation that we face and how we might navigate them. I'll begin by introducing Ian Murray, who is the Member of Parliament for Edinburgh South and has been since 2010, and has also been a leading light in the campaign for that second referendum and against Brexit. And I think we can all agree is, without doubt, South Edinburgh's second best parliamentarian. We're also very lucky to have Elaine, who is a solicitor with Balfour Manson, and importantly is the lead solicitor in that crucial court case that has just been heard at the Court of Session, that has ruled that the advice that Boris Johnson gave to the Queen on prorogation was illegal, which is a hugely important legal move, which we can all agree. We also have Hazel Nolan from the GMB Trade Union, who is a key campaigner who has previously been campaigning with Hope Not Hate. And the GMB is a trade union that represents a huge cross-section of workers. People working from domestic carers through to people working in the shipbuilding industry, from NHS workers through to people working, and I think this is the most interesting one, working in the whisky industry. But critically, what that does is provide an insight into not just the economic impact, but the impact that Brexit, and this particularly hard Brexit, will have on people's everyday working lives and their livelihoods. And finally, and perhaps the person who needs the least introduction of all, and who will also be providing the opening keynote speech, we have Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown who I think was one of, if not the most successful post-war Chancellor that this country has had, Prime Minister of this country, critically at the point of the financial crisis, whose incisive actions following that saved us from what could have been a much greater catastrophe. But perhaps, most importantly of all, in my view, was the Labour parliamentary candidate for Edinburgh South in 1979 and led the way for the people that followed him. So without further ado, I'll hand the stage over to Gordon Brown to provide the keynote address. Thank you. Thank you.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be back in Edinburgh, European Edinburgh, the most pro-European city in the whole of Britain. More pro-European than London, 3/4 of people in Edinburgh voted to stay in the European Union, and it was in no small measure due to the leadership of Daniel Johnson and Ian Murray, and I want you to thank them for what they do to put forward a pro-European. city with its internationally acclaimed festival, which has been so successful in the last few weeks, its internationally acclaimed universities, which recruit from all over the world, its internationally acclaimed reputation for the Scottish Enlightenment, which spread across the world, and of course famous now for its internationally renowned and respected judicial system. I want to praise the judges and the lawyers who spoke truth to power and were not afraid to do so in these last few days. And I want to thank Elaine for taking the action in the Court of Session. And you know, there's two other actions that I think are possible. One she has laid today in the Court of Session, and she's saying that if Boris Johnson will not sign the request to the European Union for an extension so that we can avoid a no deal, then the clerk of the Court of Session in Edinburgh, as an ordinary citizen, should do it and should be instructed to do so on behalf of the whole country. I wish your action success in the Court of Session. Action that's necessary. That document that was produced yesterday, Yellowhammer, there were many redactions in it. We need to have not just some of the truth, but all of the truth. And if necessary, we should go to court to ensure that the law of Parliament, that it should be published in full, is upheld. And I think people around the country would support that freedom of information happening. So it's a pleasure to be back in South Edinburgh. As Daniel said, I was here not so successfully actually in 1979 when I was the candidate for South Edinburgh. I remember putting on my election manifesto, this constituency needs a Member of Parliament of youth and fresh ideas. Well, the last time I stood for Parliament, I had to say this constituency, which was Dunfermline and the Kirkcaldy, needs a candidate of maturity. Luckily, we've got two representatives who've got fresh ideas and are mature and with great experience and do a wonderful job. I remember also the first time I was asked to stand for anything. I was a student at Edinburgh University, and I was asked by someone in this Edinburgh South constituency not to stand for Parliament, but to stand for the local council. And I said, look, I don't know much about local government finance. You probably think when I was Chancellor I never knew much about it either. And I said, I don't know if I can do this. And the guy said, look, you don't understand. If we were going to win the seat, you wouldn't be the candidate. So Edward's got a good way of putting people in their place. And I think it's time to put someone else in his place, and that is Mr. Boris Johnson. Difficulties with Parliament, what does he do? Suspend it. Difficulties with the Cabinet, shuts them up. Difficulties with his MPs, he throws them out of his party. Difficulties with the Constitution, he walks all over it. Difficulties with the law, it seems he's prepared to break it. And you know, this is not a Scotland-England question, as the SNP was saying last night. This is lawbreakers who have been put to rights by the law-abiding population that has support in the whole of the United Kingdom. We must uphold the rule of law. Imagine if Jeremy Corbyn had been proposing to break the law. The Conservative MPs, the very ones that are supporting Boris Johnson at the moment, would be saying that he should be in the Tower of London. They say that he should be guilty of treason. They say that he should be, like President Trump, impeached. There's got to be some logic in what we do, and it's absolutely clear to me that it is not right that the government should be able to get away with breaking the law. Now, I didn't want to use it, but I think Hope Not Hate has given me this. And actually, it's quite remarkable. It's an opinion poll done of the people of Scotland over the last few weeks. And they were asked to name the adjective or the epithet that they attached to Boris Johnson. And they had about 20 choices about, you know, intelligent, compassionate, you know, well-informed, always truthful. And so they came down with this. 32% said he was self-serving. 37% said he was untrustworthy. But 55% chose to say he was a buffoon. And you know, 30% of Conservative supporters also said that he was a buffoon. Now there's light at the end of the tunnel for him, because 3% decided that he was diplomatic, 3% said he was Churchillian, and 4% said he was statesmanlike. You know, the great debater, the great orator, Shelley had this great phrase, lost the art of communication, but not, alas, the gift of speech. That may be the best way of describing someone who looks like now the leader of the rump of a sect, of a faction, of what was a once national party. Now, any Prime Minister, looking at events as they unfold, would be asking three questions about Brexit and a no deal. Can I guarantee the food supplies to the people of this country? Can I guarantee that the medical supplies that come in from the continent, are they going to be available to all people who need them? And can I guarantee that the parts and components that industry needs, can I guarantee that they're going to be there so that jobs are not going to be lost, so that businesses can go about the normal business, so that normal trading relationships can exist in the interests of the functioning of the economy? And when you look at what is happening, he can give none of these guarantees. In fact, the documents we saw yesterday, and I urge people to read them, they're not substantial in terms of the information they give, but they make it clear to me that he cannot give these guarantees. Now, look at this issue of medicines, because I was shocked when I found out what the true situation is. You know that 1 million medical consignments come in every day from Europe. 1 million medical packages. 37 million a month, so it's more than 1 million when you think of it. Over 400 million every year. And so we rely on the flow of these goods from the continent for dealing with some of our vital health conditions. And 3/4 of these goods are coming in from Dover and Calais. And as a result, the commercial director of the National Health Service has said publicly that even if they fly goods in by air, even if you stockpile for a few weeks ahead, normally it's about 2 weeks stockpile for 6 weeks ahead, even if they do all these things, he said there will be significant disruption over the next few months and severe disruption in a few weeks of October the 31st and for these weeks. And just look at this. EpiPens, I know something about this in my family. EpiPens to deal with allergies. Most of them produced in Europe, on mainland Europe. Last year, some of you who may use EpiPens or have them will know that there was a fire in a factory in Germany and the supply was cut back and curtailed. And so people were urged to use last year to extend the use-by date of the existing injectors. Some of the injectors that were going to be taken back in were given a longer life, and prescriptions that used to be for 2 injectors, because that's the safe way that you've got 2 of them, went down to 1. Now just imagine if there is the disruption at the Channel ports, and after a few weeks, what happens to the supply of these life-saving EpiPens? If we want a no-deal Brexit to not mean a no EpiPen Brexit, we've got to make sure that we stop this no deal in its tracks. And then look at insulin. 3.8 million diabetics in this country, 1 million depend on insulin. And again, most of the insulin we use comes from production that is on mainland Europe. And they did a trial and found it was going to be difficult to guarantee all the supply of insulin that was needed. So they've now increased the stocks that are going to be available, but of course they can't store all of them in warehouses in Britain. So we have an issue with insulin for diabetics as well, if this no deal gets to the conclusion that Boris Johnson wants. And then radioisotopes for the treatment of cancer and other investigations of conditions. Again, most of these isotopes, the radioisotopes, medical radioisotopes, you would call them, I suppose, they also come from mainland Europe. But they have a very limited shelf life. The value of the radioactivity decreases very quickly, so even storing them is difficult. And again, a trial was done, and they found it was very difficult because they could not guarantee to the Scottish liver cancer patient that she could get what she needed on this one particular day. And then just one simple thing, the flu virus, doses of flu vaccine. about 5 million required. But because of what's been happening in Australia, some of you will know this, there's been a very severe outbreak of flu in Australia. It's made people reconfigure the vaccine. So the 1 million vaccines that are expected for the under 65s will not be ready by the end of October because of this reconfiguration. So how long it will take to get these vaccines in before you need them immediately, of course, for the winter months, we do not yet know. So look at the situation for medical supplies. There's probably about 150 different medical items that are not available on any one week or any one day. So that is a problem already. But think of that problem potentially getting worse, because so many items on which we depend come from Europe. Now the government say that Brexit is about taking back control, but we're losing control of our medical supplies. It is not taking back control, it is losing control. Now look at food. I was surprised too, because it used to be the case that 75% of our food was produced in Britain. It's now only about 60%. 30% of that food comes from mainland Europe, and comes in from Europe again, mainly by the ports, and particularly on the Calais to Dover route. And that's of course fresh food, where you know that most of your fruit is coming from parts of Europe and beyond, areas with commercial treaties that link through Europe, and of course vegetables, bacon and so on, and so forth. Now the problem here may be that you can solve the problem of supply, and we don't know that, but what about the problem of price? Because the minute we see the ports being clogged up, the prices of food are going to go up. The Cabinet Secretary has reported he expects a 10% rise in food prices. The retailers are suggesting that the price rise may be even more. Now, of course, Boris Johnson and his friends, they can afford it. But think of people who are depending on social security benefits or minimum wages, and the cost of food rising and the effect on their budgets. Food banks, perhaps unable to afford food because the price of the food, the amounts they need, because the prices are going up. And then take the fuel budgets, gas and electricity. Again, we are dependent on the connector that links us to the continent. So a substantial part of our electricity supply comes from mainland Europe. So again, look at the effect of this. Nobody is in any doubt in that notes that are going between the cabinet members that prices of gas and electricity will rise. In fact, in the year after the Brexit referendum, because of the devaluation of the pound, the wholesale price of gas and electricity rose between 16 and 18%. And so we've got to expect that fuel prices will rise. Now, anybody concerned about the fate, particularly of the most vulnerable people in our community and pensioners who depend in the winter months on a regular supply that they can afford of gas and electricity, anybody would say that a no deal at this time is not the right thing for our country. How can we feel secure when millions of people are going to be insecure? How can we feel at ease when millions are going to be ill at ease? How can we feel comfortable about this when millions are going to go without comfort as a result of decisions that are being made that are clearly against the national interest? And then to portray this as a patriotic act. For Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson to say that not to go ahead on October the 31st is a betrayal of Britain. It is an act of self-harm. It is a self-inflicted wound. It is a known goal. And it is a travesty to say that anything like that could ever be in the national economic interest. Now, I just want to say one thing about the politics of this. The no-deal Brexit is not the Brexit that people were promised when they voted for it in 2016. And that's why I believe that even people who were against Brexit, were against being in Europe, should be in a position to say that a no deal is unacceptable. I went back through what the statements made by the various people. Boris Johnson was saying he favoured being in the single market at that time. Now, of course, he changes his mind. And then you have Aaron Banks, the leader of the Leave campaign. He said he wanted something like Norway. Nigel Farage during the referendum said, if you had a relationship similar to that of Norway and Switzerland, that'd be fine. And then they come for this no deal. In the literature of the Leave campaign, they said their approach would be safety first. How is what they're doing safety first? They said it would be flexible. How is it flexible? At the 2017 election, Mrs May's party, in their manifesto that Boris Johnson stood on, said that the deal that they would do would be, they called it, smooth and orderly. How is it smooth and how is it orderly? Just as how did we get what they promised, a strong and stable government, when they said they would do that at this time. So it's clear to me that the deal that we are being offered is not what was said was going to happen as a result of the referendum. But to me it betrays an even bigger issue about the future of our country. Because are we to become, it's what kind of Britain, not just what kind of Brexit, are we to become an inward-looking, introverted, anti-immigrant, isolationist kind of country where people appeal to the Dunkirk spirit that standing alone is somehow the best way for Britain's future, glorying in isolation, when everybody knows that even at Dunkirk we stood alone out of necessity and not choice. We were trying to get America into the war with us. We were trying at the same time to get the French to merge with us, to save them in continental Europe, and we were depending on troops coming from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Africa, right across the old empire. This myth that standing alone is what people want for Britain has got to be disputed, because I believe that Britain can only ever reunite if we show that we are tolerant, not intolerant, show that we are outward-looking, not inward-looking, show that we are internationally engaged and not disengaged, and show, of course, that we're pragmatic and not, as the No Deal has presented it, dogmatic. Now, there's one other issue that I think we should think about in this. We will soon have a general election. Now, I agree with Nicola Sturgeon that on this question of leaving Europe, she is right to say that it will affect the Scottish economy. And so we do 2 billion of trade with Germany, we do 2.5 billion of trade with Netherlands, about 2.5 billion trade with France. And all the things that we sell to them are valuable, like whiskey has just been mentioned, to the Scottish economy. But she has to be logical about this. We do 2.5 billion of trade with Germany, and she says that if we lose the 14 billion of trade with Europe, it affects 100,000 jobs, billion of investment, £1,600 each loss of income as a result of it. But we do 2.5 billion of trade with Germany, France and Netherlands. But we do 50 billion of trade with England, Wales and Northern Ireland. If jobs are at risk from breaking trading relationships with Germany, Netherlands, France and the rest of Europe, then they're surely at risk if we break trading relationships with the rest of the United Kingdom. If it's difficult enough to break a 40-year relationship that is simply a customs union and a single market, how much more difficult is it to break a 300-year-old relationship that includes a fiscal union, a currency union, as well as a political union on top of a currency union and single market? And you see, when it comes to our choices in the next few weeks, and I want to say this when I'm here with Ian in this constituency, people can choose to vote Conservative and find that they'll be voting for Scotland to leave Europe but stay in Britain. And they can vote Nationalist and they'll find that they're voting for Scotland to leave Britain but stay in Europe. But the one candidate who'll be standing and asking you to support Scotland staying in Britain and in Europe is Ian Murray, and I think that is the proper position for Scotland's future. You see, down to what Daniel said at the beginning. It is about cooperation, not confrontation in this modern world. It's about empathy and it's not about enmity. It's about a politics that is not always us versus them and confrontational. It's about finding the basis on which there is solidarity and there is reciprocity between nations. And I think this Brexit debate is forcing us to think more deeply about what kind of country we are to be in the future. You know, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, and I come from Kirkcaldy, and I can visualise how he decided, sitting in the customs officer's house in Kirkcaldy, looking out at sea, and saw the ships coming in and out to the port in the 18th century, and he could see that trade was the engine of growth. but he also wrote the theory of moral sentiments, and it was built around the community he lived in Kirkcaldy, the school, the church, the local shops, and where he met people every single day. And Adam Smith is portrayed by some as a person who presented a selfish view of humanity, that people were out for themselves. But it was quite the opposite that he was saying, and that is what informs the Scottish Enlightenment when he wrote the theory of moral sentiments. He asked why it was that when there was an earthquake in China, nobody cared and could sleep soundly, even if millions died. But if you cut your little finger, you'd probably have a sleepless night worried about yourself. And he didn't conclude that we're all selfish. What he said was, we didn't have enough information, education, and the ability for communication to understand what was happening in different parts of our own country, in other countries, and around the world. And he talked about a circle of empathy that linked our families, our communities, our neighbourhoods, right through our country, into another continent, and right across the world. And he created this idea of an unbroken cycle, an unbroken cord of humanity that linked people in all parts of the world. There is no future for a world if we don't find a basis on which to cooperate with each other. There is no way forward if we can't replace enmity by empathy. There is no way forward if we can't replace selfishness by solidarity, and understand that we're in an interdependent world where any form of independence is bound to be limited by the interdependence that a modern economy and society brings. So we are debating not just Brexit at the moment, we're debating the future of Britain. A no-deal Brexit makes everything so glaringly problematical that it forces us to think what the consequences are for people when people cease to cooperate with each other and cease to find common ground. I've got no doubt where the people of Edinburgh will come down on this issue. We have to cooperate. We have to build a world where there is solidarity, not selfishness between peoples. And I would urge you to never stop believing that this better world is possible. Thank you very much.
Can I thank Gordon for what was undoubtedly an incredibly interesting and insightful contribution, and one which I think has given us all a huge amount to think about. Now, I'm very keen to get to the point where we open this up for a wider discussion and for questions and before we do that, I'm going to ask each of the other panel members to just briefly make a short contribution, giving their perspective for around 3 minutes each. I believe Gordon is unfortunately going to have to leave us shortly, but we'll be around for those opening contributions. So, as I previously introduced, I'll hand over to Hazel Nolan from the GMB, who will provide some insights from her perspective.
Thank you very much. As a former Hope Not Hate organiser, come GMB Scotland organiser, it is an honour to address you here today at this event. Brexit has always been bad for workers. It has been driven by a right-wing project which isn't in the interests of workers in Scotland, workers such as those in Govan, who have far more in common with those in Gdansk than they ever can have with the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg. GMB takes a no-nonsense approach to our politics. And make no mistake about it, Boris Johnson and his cabal have always wanted a no-deal Brexit. They want to exploit the chaos that will bring to push their own agenda and to serve their own interests. In 2017, my union GMB commissioned a report into the effect of a no-deal Brexit on working people across Scotland. No one was better off. There are some, even within the trade union movement, who would argue for a jobs-first Brexit. My union GMB is clear on this too. The only jobs-first Brexit that exists in reality is a Brexit where jobs are the first to go. And the Yellowhammer documents that were released last night confirm this. Fraser Valander as well estimated a job loss total of 80,000 and billions being stripped off the economy. Jobs such as those in Scotland's whisky industry, one of the biggest Scottish success stories. An industry making large profits but also providing thousands of jobs in fragile working class communities. This industry is dependent on the supply chains that run through the EU. This success story is that we have French cognac, which is poured into Polish bottles in a factory in Fife, giving thousands of people jobs. The effects of a no-deal Brexit would not just be devastating for this industry and for workers, but it would also be devastating for Scottish culture and the standing of Scotland in the world. It would jeopardise the more than 60 trade deals that Scottish whisky has access through the EU to sell whisky around the world. Now, I understand why some workers and why some trade unions voted for Brexit. Judgments such as Viking and Novell have been hammer blows for the Scottish trade union movement and the UK trade union movement and the trade union movement across the whole of the EU. Workers take pride in the work they do, and it's often crucial to both our identity and how we define our communities. When I introduce myself, I say, I'm Hazel Nolan, I'm a trade union officer. So I can understand why communities devastated by deindustrialisation, which prided themselves on their industry, watched as their yards and their factories closed and their children faced the choice of low-paid precarious work or moving away from home. To those people, take back control was a seductive and powerful message. However, the reality is that a Tory-driven, no-deal Brexit would leave them with even less control. But we do owe it to them to do everything we can to both avoid the nightmare scenario of crashing out without no deal, and when we remain in the EU, to fighting to reform it so that we can deliver a socially just Europe for everyone to take a share in. Thank you.
Hazel. I'd also then just like to move on to Elaine, who is Chair of the Balfour Council, although she is speaking here this evening in a personal capacity.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for the invitation. I'm not going to give you a constitutional law lecture tonight. And to be honest, when I went to those lectures many years ago, I was bored rigid. The lecture was fantastic. It was a topic that was very dry and nothing was really happening in it. Well, that changed at the time of devolution and at the Human Rights Act coming in, and we've seen, fortunately, a revival in it, but most importantly, over the past 2 or 3 years, and I've been hugely privileged to be involved in probably the two biggest cases, the Article 50 case that we took to the European Court of Justice on that. We were pilloried, not personally, but by various academics and senior QCs, that we started too soon, that we were taking the wrong arguments, that we were doomed to failure. And then when I sat there with 400 members of the public and judges, 26 across the European Union, I thought, well, actually, we might just be right here. So, it was an amazing moment to know that a small team, 7 petitioners, fantastic people who were brave enough to step up, and we could step behind them and drive it forward. And that was a momentous moment for, I think, our Scottish courts, because they agreed the reference for us, and that was fantastic. And I think that has been driven through by yesterday's decision by the Inner House. 2 of the judges that gave the decisions yesterday also sat in the Whiteman case and the Article 50 case. And I sat there listening to the arguments and my heart rose because I could tell that they were engaged. What I didn't know was whether it would be engaged enough to give us what we thought was right. And 78 cross-party parliamentarians were my clients, or are my clients. I don't think there's ever been a court action with so many parliamentarians joining hands and forces to stand up and say, there is the sovereignty of Parliament that has to be protected, and the rule of law that has to be the core of our society, and every part of the 3 pillars of the state required to abide by that. And, sorry, I'm actually going to get quite emotional because it is so important to understand that the balance has to be in place in order to have a benign democracy. And I think that's why this case in particular has really come through, because the balance has become skewed. And that's why constitutional law has come to the fore, because that's when the court has to step in and say, this is our job. This is why we are here. To make sure that there is that balance that allows us to run a smooth and safe democracy. So 78 parliamentarians and Nolan Mom, who is the founder of the Good Law Project, he's the driver of this, an extraordinary individual and a QC. We'll be going to the Supreme Court next Tuesday and Wednesday. And please watch it. It will be live on TV, even if just for 10 minutes. I will be hiding behind Aidan O'Neill. I'll stop now. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that insight, Elaine, and thank you for what you're doing. I think yesterday's court decision is undoubtedly, I think, a key point in this country's history. But as you were saying that, and you mentioned that you've got 78 parliamentarians as your client, I was wondering if there was a polite collective noun for such a group of individuals. But on that point, I'll hand over to Ian Murray and see if he has an answer for it.
Yes, petitioners. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to everyone for being here, and particularly to the panel. Just before I start to give my slight contribution, I just want to say something about what Elaine and her colleagues have done, because isn't it wonderful that we have a democracy whereby ordinary members of the public can take the government to court to make sure the government doesn't overstep its mark? And that's something we should cherish and something we should celebrate. And although politics and democracy hasn't really covered itself in glory in the last few months, I think the very fact that we've been able to prove, and Elaine's been able to prove, that actually the courts are the final arbiters of democracy in this country is something we should all celebrate. So Elaine, thank you for that. Thank you for allowing us to be petitioners on your great case. Look, I want to start this. I feel a little bit like Victor Meldrew, because I've been wandering around this constituency for the last few months, and people have been stopping me in the street asking me what's going on, and I feel a bit like the Grim Reaper. So let me start with some stuff that's a bit more positive. We haven't left the European Union yet. We should have left on the 29th of March. It didn't happen. We should have left on the 31st of October. It won't happen. So that is a big positive. Let me tell you the other big positives. Because Parliament has actually been doing its job against the executive, we had votes won under amendments brought by the Conservative Dominic Grieve, or he was Conservative Dominic Grieve, he's probably been thrown out of the party by now, and that meant that we had a vote in Parliament on the deal that the former Prime Minister brought to the House. That would not have happened. The Prime Minister would just have been able to sign that deal without those votes, had we not won those votes in Parliament by a narrow majority of 2 or 3. We've got the Yellowhammer report that was produced last night, albeit slightly redacted, and albeit not really saying very much that we didn't already know, but only published because we won votes in Parliament. We've got an extension on the 29th of March to the 31st of October because we won votes in Parliament, and we've got this extension now because we've won votes in Parliament. So the executive isn't getting away with anything at the moment, and I think we should also celebrate the fact that everyone's working together who has a sensible position with regards to leaving the European Union and bringing that together to the floor of the House of Commons. My short contribution, I just want to say a few things. I want to just perhaps try and explain as best as possible where we are in Parliament at the moment, and if Elaine's constitutional law lectures were boring, and if anybody nods off, just he can wake you up after the end of this, because it is slightly complicated, but I think it is worth describing where we are. We took control of the order paper, which is pretty unprecedented, the second time that it's now been done, to promote a private bill last week brought by Hilary Benn, called the Benn Bill. And what we managed to do was take control of the order paper and pass a bill that said, quite simply, that the Prime Minister has until the 19th of October, which is the next EU Council meeting, to either get a deal voted favourably through the House of Commons, or get the House of Commons to vote in favour of no deal. Otherwise, at the EU Council meeting on the 19th of October, the Prime Minister has to demand an extension to the 31st of January. Now, as Gordon has already said, the Prime Minister said he may not abide by the law and he may not sign that, But as we've heard today, Elaine and her colleagues have brought another petition to the courts to say that this is the law of this country, and if the Prime Minister won't sign that letter, then somebody else would be able to sign it on his behalf. That's now gone through the House of Commons, and the reason that we haven't voted for a general election, on top of all of that, through the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. The Fixed Term Parliaments Act, incidentally, was brought in 2011 to protect the coalition government at that time. There's only two ways you can bring a general election. That is through getting 2/3 of MPs to vote, so that's 434, to vote in favour of it, as it happened in the snap general election of 2017, or a vote of no confidence in the government that's won by simple majority, but then you're able to try and form another government, and if you can't form another government in 14 days, you therefore go to the country in a general election. That's the only two ways to get one. And the reason we didn't vote with the government on the two occasions that was brought over the last 10 days was firstly because the Prime Minister himself brought this to the House, and that automatically makes everyone suspicious. And secondly, because the Prime Minister wanted to try and call this general election over the period of time that the EU Council would be meeting and that the letter to extend to 31st of January was in place, we didn't trust him not to sign that letter and get the extension. So we'll all vote for a general election after the 31st of October when that is in place and no deal is taken off the table. Otherwise we can't trust the Prime Minister to do it. And I'm sorry to say that actually, because I think it's the first time in history, regardless of political opinions, that you could say you don't trust a Prime Minister. In the last 10 days alone, the Prime Minister has politicised the police, he's derided the judges, he's shut down Parliament, he's silenced his own party, he's told his own cabinet ministers they were free to speak and then sacked them, he's lied to the Queen, he said he wouldn't prorogue Parliament and then prorogued Parliament, he said he wouldn't have a general election and then brought a motion to the House to have one. So this Prime Minister doesn't really have a very good track record, and that's why not only people on the opposition benches don't trust him, and not only do people on his own benches not trust him, but actually I think the public are becoming increasingly wary of whether or not this Prime Minister can be trusted. So that's where we are at the moment in parliamentary terms. At 3 a.m. on Tuesday morning, Parliament prorogued for 5 weeks. Hopefully we'll be back next week if we're able to be successful and Elaine's able to be successful in the Supreme Court next week, and prorogation would be removed. And I also think we shouldn't be breaking up for conference recess. We should be sitting every single day, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, if we need to do so, to be able to get a solution to this particular crisis. I'll finish with this, and I've said this before. Party politics is broken down at the moment because we're all working across party lines. And the reason we're doing that is because it's in the national interest to do so. We're all working very, very closely together to try and find a consensus. And the number of Conservative backbenchers that are now coming across to the views of a confirmatory vote are astonishing. I just received a text, as Gordon was speaking there, that the Conservative Antoinette Sandbach has just signed up to the People's Vote campaign. So we're now close to 30 who've declared now on the Conservative benches. We just need to get that parliamentary majority. And if we get a confirmatory vote on the table, with any deal that is passed by Parliament, we'll then have the option of remain on the ballot paper, and I think the British public will vote to remain in the European Union. The irony being that everyone now knows what the European Union does, as opposed to what was happening in 2016. So we're going to open up to questions, so I'll stop there, but happy to take questions on anything to do with parliamentary procedure or anything to do with where Parliament might go in the next few months. And if I'm able to give you answers that you believe, I'm either lying to you or don't really know where we're going to go. Try our best, but thank you very much indeed.
So I'm now going to open up to questions from the floor, but just briefly before I do, I just want to just sort of say a couple of sort of points of broad housekeeping. First of all, we have presented a very particular point of view. I think the primary purpose of this is for you to understand what we are doing and what our point of view is as we enter this. I am very keen to hear from all points of view, and if there are people who have different point of view, it would be good to hear from you. But more importantly, just in terms of just some housekeeping, I'm going to try and be as fair as possible. I'm going to try and work my through the room. I'm also going to try and be as gender balanced in terms of taking questioners as possible. So with that all out of the way, if people would like to raise their hands if they'd like to ask a question. So there's a lady at the front. Yeah, just you. Yeah.
Katrina Becker. I'm a professor at the University of Edinburgh. I want to start out by thanking Elaine. I got to shake Jomon's hand in front of the Court of Session last week, and thank you very much for speaking tonight. I welled up when you welled up, so thank you. And thank you, Hazel, for speaking very clearly about what Brexit is, which is a project by the Tories, by the rich, for the rich, to benefit the rich and only the rich. And basically, if we look at what happened since 2010, the Tories came in, they explained that austerity was needed because Labour left all those debts, oh, isn't it horrible? And then they brought in austerity politics that made everyone really angry at them. Everyone had someone who lost their benefits, who lost their mobility card, who lost things that were absolutely vital to them. So anger built up, and that it was no longer good enough to blame Labour, so there had to be something else. And then they generated this thing that is Brexit to cause more chaos and reap more havoc. So I think this is all about coming together, and I think it's really heartening that there are 78 MPs who work together and there's more and more collaboration. But actually, what I'm missing in the Labour Party is a bit more extremism, to the point where they reject Brexit out of hand as this Tory Brexit. It may be that in the end a people's vote is the only way out of it, but if we have a people's vote, we legitimise the view that there could be a Brexit, any Brexit, that is beneficial or of interest for the UK, and I don't think there is. And just as a last point, Yellowhammer is the base projection for what's going to happen in a no-deal Brexit. There is an even worse projection out there, but we've not seen for any sector, and especially for science and higher education, Brexit is absolutely horrendous. We've not seen a credible best prediction, and nobody has asked to a Freedom of Information release of the best projection. There is no benefit to Brexit, so why does Labour not reject this Tory project?
Thank you. Just before, I think I'm keen to ask either Gordon or Ian about their view about what Labour needs to say and do about Brexit. But can I just make it very clear? I resigned from the front bench of the Labour Party in the Scottish Parliament for precisely that reason. There is no such thing as a good Brexit. Labour, if it is to be an internationalist progressive party, has to campaign not just for a people's vote, but to remain in the European Union, because that is what is in the best interest of working people in this country, and I'm very clear on that.
Yeah, very briefly, you raised a lot of points there. Look, Brexit has been rejected out of hand. It's how we navigate to the next stage. And I do think that if you end up in a binary position at the 11th hour of revocation versus no deal, then there will be a majority for revocation. The problem I think there is being able to legitimise that. So if there's an option to revoke, and I think we should revoke, I think the pathway to revocation is through a public vote, and everybody apart from the vast majority of the Conservatives, but not all, are now behind that. Now the reason that we're not talking explicitly about revocation is because we need to get that majority in Parliament. And that's the key thing here. This is about parliamentary mathematics at the end of the day. There's 646 or so members of Parliament that have a vote, 640 minus Sinn Féin who don't take their seats. So unless you can get to 321, this is all academic. We know we can't get to 321 by straight revocation, and therefore we might be able to get to 321 to have a people's vote. So it's purely practical in terms of getting that parliamentary majority. Otherwise it's all over, I'm afraid, and that's why we're all fighting to get that public vote with the option to remain. We get to that point, and then I think we can have a real fight in the country about what's in the best direction. I set up the People's Vote campaign with my colleagues back in April 2018. I was one of the first MPs to do so, and the Kyle Wilson amendment, which is the one that says as soon as the returning officer for the United Kingdom stands up and announces the result at the end of this confirmatory vote process, whichever piece of legislation wins becomes law, so that takes out anything to do with whether or not we go forward. And if I just very quickly, I don't want to hold the mic, but just very quickly say on top of that, there is a risk that you could lose a people's vote. There is a risk that that could be the case. But then the country will have at least spoken and said that's the direction they want to go in, which is why, against my better judgment, and I'm not defending the Labour leadership in this in any way, but which is why they've said, well, let's go and get the best deal possible. And then if we put the best deal possible to confirmatory vote and we win it to remain, great. If we lose it, at least we've got the least worst option. So rather than having a Johnson deal or a May deal that's been roundly rejected, let's have a good deal, and then at least we'll have be able to be in a much better position come the end of the confirmatory vote. But I have to say, I will be campaigning vociferously for Remain like we did before. We were on every door, every leaflet of this constituency, and I know a lot of my colleagues were as well. And we need to win that in the country, and if we can win a confirmation vote in the country, we can not just stay in the European Union, but I think we can bring the country back together as well.
So could we have the next question? Having gone from the right-hand side of the room, we'll go to the left, and the gentleman over there, yes.
We've heard very little, I think, about the preparations for a public vote. And it doesn't seem to me a very simple question as to how you organise it. And I was wondering whether that actually is just an illusion, but lots has been done.
Organisation of public vote.
Well, the reason you've not heard much about the organisation of a public vote is we're concentrating laser-like on getting it. Because as soon as you start talking about if you get it, what then happens, you open up all the arguments about what should be on the ballot paper, what the franchise should be, what the spending limit should be, etc., etc. And all that is really an argument for tomorrow, once we've got the people's vote in place. That's the first. It also spooks people, so just to emphasise the answer I just gave to the lady before, all the arguments, a lot of constituents have criticised me for not going around the streets with people's vote petitions, etc., etc. But if I'm being quite frank, that's a complete waste of time at the moment, because this is about parliamentary maths. Until we can get the parliamentary maths to a majority, then we're not able to get that public vote. And if you talk about things like what's on the ballot paper, what the franchise would be, how it would all work, it spooks the people who are finding it difficult to come across. So we just have to hold our nerve at the moment to get that together. And my view is, if we do end up with a public vote, I think we need measurable propositions. We shouldn't be selling unicorns again. We shouldn't be saying that nobody's talking about leaving the single market and the customs union when no deal's at the back of their mind. We need a measurable proposition that said, here is the deal that's on the table and this is the consequences of it, versus here is the deal we currently have and we all know what the consequences of that are. And we measure both of those and then the public can decide.
Right. Next question, and I think I'll go to the back. The lady who's right by Lewis, right there, yes.
Very simple question. Is there anything an individual can do to support you and to support the campaign you're trying to wage? Does it do any good marching? What can we do? We're feeling powerless.
Do you any money? Sorry, I shouldn't say that. There are things you can do. Join the People's Vote campaign online. There's a march in Edinburgh on the 21st of September. Keep writing to me and to your other elected representatives. Talk to people, neighbours, colleagues, everyone, family, everyone that you can speak to about it. If you can, donate money to the People's Vote campaign and to the other organisations like Hope Nor Hate who are doing some wonderful stuff. Support people like Elaine at the court session if you're able to get there on a 10 o'clock in the morning when the court session is taking place, but just keep providing that support. That's the best way of doing it. Keep making the arguments, and hopefully we'll be able to get to a position where we have another public vote, and then it will be all hands on deck to make sure we can make the case in the public.
Can I come in here? I just want to add that when we had our first hearing before Lord Doherty, I have to say we were pretty clear. We thought we would lose because it's a very hard thing for a single judge to make the call on. But what I was inspired by was the fact that the public gallery was full. And if you are able to come along to these cases, then yes, they are quite dull in bits. And sometimes you get a good line coming out, like Lord Brodie last week came out with a fantastic line to the government. Is one man's high politics not another man's low tricks? Which completely stumped senior counsel for the government, I have to add. So, it's that kind of support. And the ladies that were outside of court last week, they were there through rain and shine, and, it's just very uplifting when, as a lawyer, you're continually battling And when you see that, and actually the emails that I've received since yesterday have been really quite touching. I've had no nasty emails, all congratulatory for my team, because it's a team effort. And yeah, so show your support in very gentle ways, and that can make the world a difference.
That's a very good point, thank you. So would you, right, the gentleman with the beard in the, I think, third row back.
I'm not a party member, but, sorry? Okay. But what I'm asking is, we are all terrified at the possibility of what seems to be confronting us. But we are also, many people find it very difficult to know what to do in the future, as does the Parliament. And so when Gordon Brown said about voting for a certain party or not, the people who seem to have risen up to the heads of many of the parties are not necessarily the people that we want to run the government. So what has happened is, for example, Watson has said that he would prefer to have a vote to see how people, a referendum to see how people feel before an election, and Corbyn has said he would like to have an election and then worry about what the people feel. This is a little bit worrying, and this is not an attack it's not an attack on the Labour Party in any way. It's just a way of thinking. But I wonder what your thoughts are of how do we go to a kind of middle zone?
A good question.
So let me just say at the very start, so this isn't a party political meeting.
No.
The way that the audience was compelled was I essentially sent out letters to people in the circumference of the Churchill Theatre as the only selection that we had. So, and then when we had a bit more space, we sent some out to a slightly further circumference. So this isn't a party meeting at all. So not being part of a political party sitting in the audience is actually a great benefit in these meetings, in actual fact. In terms of what should come first, I'm very much of the view that a general election is something that the very fact that we have general elections in this country is for you to choose the government. And I do feel as if we have a general election soon, we'd end up in a position where it just becomes a coupon election for the European Union. And you could end up in a situation whereby, particularly if the Conservatives do a deal with the Brexit Party, which I wouldn't rule out, even though they're ruling it out at the moment, but they say a lot of things and then change their position, that we could end up with a general election in this country where the only question on the ballot paper is remain or leave. And I think that's incredibly dangerous. So in an ideal world, I would prefer to have a confirmatory vote first, for that to be successful in terms of staying in the European Union, or even if it's lost in terms of leaving the European Union, and then have the general election. I think that's a much more sensible approach to have. Now, you could have a general election before that, but then you lose the opportunity potentially to have that confirmatory referendum if the election goes a different way. And I do think that the public should really get this issue resolved first before they decide to choose their government later.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to answer that point about sequencing and
Well, I don't want to be misunderstood, because I think you did misunderstand what I was saying. I said it is likely that there will be an election soon. The better way of dealing with this is Parliament is deadlocked. It cannot reach a decision about the future of Europe. It has rejected almost every option that has been before it. It has now rejected a no deal. The obvious thing to do, if there was a majority in Parliament, was to say, we cannot reach a decision, we have to put it back to the people. And that's what Ian is saying to you. The problem, as Ian has outlined, is that Parliament cannot agree with a majority in favour of a referendum at this stage. Nor now can it agree to have a majority in favour of the general election. The more likely outcome, because that's the way the debate in Parliament is going, is that there could be a general election. But at the moment, they can't agree on both. So we've got quite fundamental problems in our democracy now. I mean, first of all, how do you get an informed debate? And when the previous speaker said, I feel powerless, it's not just about your ability to do something, it's about whether there is an informed debate across the country. And we've moved from a situation where people relied on political parties to articulate people's opinions and then express them by getting into government. And we've now got a social media that is actually far more powerful, but it encourages extremes. So you have extreme positions on both sides, and it's like a shouting match without an umpire. And it goes by the way of being some sort of popular democracy where people can express their views. There is got to be a better way found to have a more informed democracy in this country. I actually favour citizens' assemblies where citizens around the country, as they did in Ireland before the abortion referendum, they had a debate about the issues which were difficult and delicate and actually very controversial in Ireland at the time. And they managed to find a way forward. This group of people who came from different positions managed to understand each other's position, may not have agreed with it, but understood that it was possible to disagree and to do so without being disagreeable. And Ireland managed to resolve an issue that had haunted it for many years, the issue of abortion. I think you could have done the same in Britain. Get citizens together in different parts of the country, representatives groups, looking at the issues, show it on television, give the chance of radio coverage on the internet, and then you interrogate the experts, you get the different points of view, and they're asked questions, you get all the information before you, and then people have got a better chance to see what these different arguments are. Now, if that had happened before the European referendum in 2016, I'm absolutely sure that we would not have the vote that we had then, and might still have now in the absence of people getting the full information and being given the opportunity to hear it firsthand in their own communities what the effect of Brexit is going to be. So these issues that have come in are raising fundamental questions. You know, for a referendum, there is no process by which Parliament decides on a referendum that is well agreed or understood. It's ad hoc. David Cameron wanted a referendum. He had a referendum. He pushed it through the House of Commons and got it. But you know, how do you decide on when to have the next referendum? There's no mechanism. There's no suggestion. You have to wait a number of years. You have to do this or do that. It's all ad hoc, and therefore our constitution is being exposed. And far from being this great constitution that evolves over time and can deal with all the problems, which relies on there being a degree of trust, it is being exposed as a constitution in drastic need of reform. So I'm not trying, and I hope my speech didn't give the impression that I'm trying for easy answers and easy solutions. I understand that we are in a mess over Europe, we're in a mess over our constitution, we're in a mess over the future of the Union. And you will only be able to solve these problems and bring unity to this country again if you can agree on an informed basis on which decisions and discussion can happen in the future. So I'm one who says complex issues have been raised and we've got to find a better way of resolving it. But I do come back to this view that unity in this country will not be around an intolerance or an insularity or an inward-lookingness or an anti-immigrant position. The only way this country will ever come together again, and this is going to be really difficult, I mean the divisions are very deep now, the only way it will come together is if we are outward-looking, if we're pragmatic, if we agree that we're going to be tolerant, if we go back to the ideas that liberty and fairness are at the centre of the way we think about things and organise our politics. I'm giving a complex answer, but I think it's important.
Sorry, it would be remiss of me not to get in when you mentioned Ireland and citizens' assemblies, being an Irish trade union official. I think that is it. I think we have to relook at our democracy in the UK as a result of everything that's happened around Brexit. I don't think that it makes any sense whatsoever, I'm not speaking as a politician, to have a general election before a confirmatory vote, because even the political parties are divided on it. So even what Ian said about having a coupon election is impossible because the Tories are divided on their positions on Brexit. There are also some Labour Party politicians who are in favour of Brexit. So that makes it challenging. So that in itself is impossible. The whole way that the referendum was phrased in the first place was also wrong because there wasn't a conversation about what people were actually voting for. So certainly the GMB's position is definitely that we need to have a people's vote first before we can ever have a general election, yeah.
Could I see a show of hands again? So there's a lady, I think, in the very back row of the left-hand section.
Yes, I just want to introduce one of the 3.5 million EU nationals sitting here, my husband sitting there. There you go. Last time when there was a meeting in the same hall, I was here and it was explained, unfortunately I've forgotten my name, by the law professor, that we could have been given a vote with the first referendum, but it was chosen by the government, or whatever reason, we were not given a vote. We do not have a vote in Westminster, we do not have representation in Westminster. Brexit has a huge effect on our lives, our family, our personal family, specifically, and here's the point, and I have written letters to you name it, Theresa May, Sajid Javid, Hilary Benn, Yvette Cooper, Harriet Harman, the Scottish executive of the EU. I have hardly had an answer. Our adult children who are not in the EU living and working at the moment, but perfectly happy living, working, earning their own adult life elsewhere, will not be allowed in anymore. They will not be allowed in. The only way they can come in, and that's the answer I get back, is through the big immigration highway, together with people from Pakistan, people from Bolivia, people from Canada. It doesn't matter anymore. We have paid more than 20 years tax. We have lived here, we've worked here, this is our home. You are my neighbors, you are my friends, best friends sitting with us here, always campaigning for us. How can anyone in Britain say, in the government or any other parliamentarian, say, you will be all right, because we will not be all right. So my question is here, can the People's Vote campaign for our votes in the next whatever?
I think that's an excellent point, and can I, before I hand over, I can just say that I think that EU citizens living in this country have been treated appallingly throughout this whole process. Can I begin, actually, perhaps, forgive me, Elaine, if I'm going to put you on the spot here. I'm wondering if there's any legal aspects to this or any human rights aspects which could be raised either by the disenfranchisement or what actually might possibly happen from the immigration points that have just been raised by the questioner.
I can't answer the latter of that, but before, sorry, I'll switch myself on. I can't answer the latter of those, but I know at the time of the referendum we put a complaint into Europe in relation to the franchise, and we were knocked back. It was far too political for them to deal with. I also know one of my fellow university students, a lady called Jacqueline McLennan, who works in Brussels and has done for many years. She took a litigation to challenge this and didn't succeed either. So I think there may be routes, and I think it's probably worth a fresh look if we can get to the stage of another referendum. I think it's appalling that individuals who live here, who are European, or indeed Britons who live out with, do not have the vote on this. And it was done for a very political reason, I'm sure, but very unfortunate.
I think it is worth pointing out that EU citizens have the right to vote in Scottish Parliament elections and local government elections, and had the right in the independence referendum in 2014, so it is anomalous. Ian, will the People's Vote campaign take up this to extend the franchise to EU citizens?
Absolutely. I mean, if I'm being completely honest, there's a problem about having a confirmation vote referendum and a different franchise, because we don't want people to cry foul. But let's leave that sticking to the wall for an argument for another day. But this just highlights the problem that we don't have any rules. And that's what Gordon said just a few moments ago. We don't have a referendum act in this country, and I think the first thing that needs to happen is for that framework to be put in place, which says whichever referendum you're having, whether it be about legalising cannabis or abortion or EU referendum, here are the rules, here are the parameters, here's the franchise, how much money you can spend, the sanctions if you break those rules. And if that's set down in law at the start, it doesn't matter what the subject is, people would know they would have to abide by those rules. And we don't have those rules in this country. And I think you've just spoken very eloquently about the human side of all of this. There's been stories from all of my colleagues from constituents who've been living in the UK for sometimes up to 50 or 60 years, who've been denied their settled status because they've not filled out the form correctly or the government have lost their files, and it's just pretty disgraceful to treat people that way. And I think you may be referring to the meeting we had in this hall in January this year, where we did give an assurance that EU nationals would be okay, because at that time it was, but I think we said we weren't quite sure what would happen, and that just proves the point that we weren't sure what was going to happen, because now the future is slightly more uncertain than it was back in January. This is something the UK government can sort really quickly. My good friend Alberto Costa, who's the Conservative MP, Scottish Italian born, for South Leicestershire, brought a bill to the House that was passed, and the government are ignoring it, which is why he resigned from government. So this can be sorted, but I think it just shows you that we don't have the rules in this country that require. Now, I did say before that I think it was partly an EU law that prevented EU nationals from voting in this country, which is why I think maybe the court cases have been defeated, and I did endeavour to find out if that was the case, and I haven't done so, but I will do clarify that position.
Can we have another question? So there's a gentleman right in the centre at the back there. Yes.
I would like to use the benefit of having Mr. Brown here, in that you mentioned 1979, and Mr. Murray mentioned not talking about the logistics of franchise or a people's vote. I think the thing that struck me about 1979 was that the voter share between yes and no for a Scottish Parliament were almost identical to the yes and no for leaving the EU. We didn't get a Scottish Parliament in 1979 because one of Mr. Brown's colleagues very carefully added an amendment that said 40% of the population had to vote for a Scottish Parliament. They didn't achieve that. I hope that when we have a second referendum, we can include something akin to that. I'm tired of hearing the refrain saying, we've got a mandate from the people. Only 37% of the population voted to leave the EU. And I don't understand why nobody had the insight to look back at 1979 and use that as an example for the next vote.
So, Gordon, lessons from 1979 and supermajorities.
You're entering a very difficult territory. It's reminding me of all the problems of 1979 when I fought this campaign, and I think it started badly and it fell away. The referendum campaign in '79 was obviously dominated by this 40% group. So you had to get far more than a 50% vote to be able to win. And this just raises a problem. You're suggesting, and rightly so, that you've got to think about the rules that govern referenda. It's just what Ian's been talking about. We have no rules. The referenda that have been called in this country in the last 40 years, since 1975, 44 years, have been called on the basis that the Prime Minister of the day usually thinks he can win it. And therefore, if he's got a majority in the House of Commons, or she, they will push through the vote. And in 1979, Jim Callaghan did not have a majority, and therefore one of his backbench MPs, George Cunningham, put in this amendment. But until we've got an agreement on what rules govern elections and govern referenda, and that requires some form of constitutional debate about that, then every referendum will be ad hoc. It will just be what the governing party of the day, or the parliament of the day, is able to agree on. And you will exclude 16-year-olds if they're not thought about. You'll exclude EU nationals because you can't get a majority on that. It's all ad hoc. You've got to think about the future. And then if it's ad hoc, then everybody then says it's an unfair process. It's been done to suit the convenience of the leader of the day. So we do need this informed debate to give us some guidance about what the future rule governing referenda are. Look, if I go back to 2016, I talked to David Cameron a few times during this referendum campaign. And the first thing that it was obvious to me was that there was no positive argument being put for being in Europe. I mean, if you go back to that campaign, it was Project Fear. What would happen if you left? But the idea that Britain could be leading in Europe, the idea that Britain had shaped Europe, the idea that we had things to do that would benefit British people from being in Europe, that we were an interdependent economy, all these things were lost. The second thing was that the Remain position, there was no thought given to the arguments of people who were worried about our membership of the European Union in a way that could be constructive. I think on migration, if you look at what's happening in Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, France, Switzerland's also covered by freedom of movement, even though it's outside the EU. In Germany, you have to register for a job if you come to the country, within freedom of movement. In Belgium, you have to leave after 9 months if you don't get a job, within freedom of movement. In Switzerland, jobs have got to be advertised locally in high unemployment areas to give the local people a chance under freedom of movement. France, social dumping, paying Latvian workers Latvian wages for working in France, banned. All these things could have been offered in the British referendum if they'd done a proper negotiation. Sovereignty, look at sovereignty. Under the treaties of Lisbon and Maastricht, the European Court of Justice has got to take into account national interests and national institutions. They've got to take into account national identity. They cannot ignore that in the judgment. So Parliament could easily have passed a law saying that we assert our position that if the European Court of Justice does not take into account national identity when it's making its judgments, then we will not abide by their decisions. And that would have gone through, and it would have been acceptable, and it would have helped us defeat the arguments that said sovereignty has been transferred forever to somewhere else. And there was so little adequate thinking done about the case that the Remain group had, and so much complacency about winning, that the case was not properly put. And this is my problem with the future. If there is going to be another referendum, which Ian has put the case for, and I would like to see myself, then the Remain case is going to be put far better than it was in the past. With Ian supporting Daniel and others and putting the positive case for Europe. Because in a modern, integrated, interdependent economy, the idea that leaving is of benefit should be capable of being exposed to everybody in every industry, in every sector. And that's what we fail to do. We need the positive case for the future.
Point about the positive case. I'm wondering, Hazel, if you could maybe provide some insight from the trade union movement and what Europe's done for workers' rights.
Yeah, I'd like to come in on that. Actually, even before I was a trade union official, when I used to work for Hope Not Hate, I used to campaign in Stoke-on-Trent, I used to campaign in Essex, I used to campaign up in Bradford. Really difficult places to campaign. And as soon as the election was called, I knew that there was no way that remaining in the EU was going to win. I've knocked on way too many doors in too many constituencies to know that that was going to happen, and the anger that people felt. Because while we did generate a lot of wealth from being in the EU, it wasn't distributed fairly at all. Okay? And people make emotional decisions and they post-rationalise them when it comes to election campaigns. You can see how campaigns are won and lost really simply. Even if you look at the United States, which is going through a similar kind of process with Trump as we are going through with Brexit, right? Trump's campaign was brilliant, make America great again. Hillary Clinton's campaign was, I'm with her, not even she's with us, right? When we ran the 2016 campaign here, everyone knows what it was. It was take back control. Who here, apart from the politicians involved in the Remain campaign, remembers the Remain slogan? Who was it talking to? It wasn't talking to workers who are suffering, right? It wasn't talking to people in communities that have seen their identity go when their industry disappears as well. Now, I can fully understand why, if you're a worker, for example, in Fife right now, and you're looking at the empty yards in Bifab, you're wondering, why is that? It's because the EU, because we like to play the EU as some sort of bogeyman if and when it suits us. When the UK government or when local authorities do something really good and a new hospital's been built, right? It's that's the local politicians. And when something bad happens, it's Europe's fault, despite the fact that Europe probably funded 60% of the roads that have been built or whatever else it was. We have empty yards for workers in Fife right now in BIFAB, and there are yards in Spain that are full of work. We have to have an honest conversation about where these decisions are being made as well, and that has to be an integral part of the next campaign if we've got any chance of winning it.
And if anyone in the audience asks us to name what the Remain campaign slogan was, I'm going to get security to throw you out.
So I think we've got time for 2 or 3 more questions. So if I can see a show of hands, I think there's a lady in the middle there. Yeah. Could you just wait for the microphone? It's just coming. Thank you.
If you're going to be creating a list of rules about referenda, why don't we make them mandatory? That you have to vote. In Uruguay, if you don't vote, you pay a fine. And I'm just thinking, just over a third of the electorate voted to leave. And that, to my thinking, is not enough for this massive chaos that's occurred since. It needs to be the full electorate involved. And this includes all of the young people who have come of age to vote now. I think that we all need to have our voices counted.
It's an interesting point, and as somebody who's a researcher who's just left is Australian, I think compulsory voting is an interesting point. Does anyone in the panel like to, do we think we should have?
I'm a big supporter of compulsory voting as long as people vote the right way.
The issue, though, I don't think with the European referendum was about the turnout. It was about the lack of information involved in the debate and how we have that debate. It was, and unless we're engaging properly and people know what they're voting for and we're having that educated conversation, then there's no point. In Ireland, we often get the opportunity to vote twice on EU referendums. We usually get the right answer second time. But normally, what our experience has been, and it's been because the assemblies, like Gordon Brown mentioned, in Ireland, the citizens' assemblies put forward the legislation for which we voted on abortion, and the whole of civil society was involved in that debate. I think it's very easy to say, well, we'll just find people who don't turn out to vote. Well, they might just turn out and vote, how do you know how they're going to vote? Is that going to be an informed vote? And I think the most important thing is that the vote is informed, not whether or not people are turning out. Hopefully we'll get both of those things.
That's a very good point.
I remember during the referendum campaign there was interviews with the Leave side, and I remember this guy being interviewed on the Leave side, and the interviewer was getting more and frustrated, asking, why are you against Europe? Why you got so much hostility to Europe? Why? Eventually the interviewer said, out of frustration, said, is it ignorance or is it apathy? And the guy replied, I don't know and I don't care.
Okay, to see a show of hands. So there's a gentleman in the second row at the front there.
Thank you very much. There's just a question about the strategy over the next few weeks, and whether one is in danger of underestimating your opponent. Dominic Cummings is supposed to be this Machiavellian mastermind. He studies Sun Tzu, the art of war, the Chinese general behind the art of war. Apparently one of those strategies is to give your enemy a false sense of of security. So I just wonder whether the display of breathtaking incompetence to date so far with Boris Johnson is in fact a cunning plan, and whether in fact he may come back yet with some deal, and maybe it's very difficult then to oppose that deal because of this whole route for being out without deal. Your thoughts on that? Thanks.
Who'd like to start there? Has Boris got a cunning plan?
If Boris has got a cunning plan, then I thank him because he's keeping me very busy. Do you really think he's got a cunning plan? I think he's got very clever advisors, and and I don't doubt that for a second to see some of the comments that are coming out. On that, in terms of the documents that the government are trying to get, that is undoubtedly linked with our litigation, and it will be interesting to see if ultimately we produce anything. I listened to their answers yesterday as to why they weren't coming out, and I have to say I didn't understand them at all. It's a lot of words, but not much logic behind it. So I suspect there will be an awful lot more work there, and just wait and see. Personally, I don't think there is a coming plan, other than, as Gordon was saying, this idea of just being almost the strong man who's standing up and saying, I can do it, and just follow me, and I'm kind of semi-Trump or Winston Churchill. I can remember a few years ago I said to one of my colleagues that he was dressing himself up as a Winston Churchill. And if you just watch how he walks and how he talks, that's exactly what he's doing, and he's almost trying to morph into that character, in my personal view. So.
Well, Churchill did try to unite the country. Boris Johnson is using the Trump tactic, that's to divide the country. I think that he can get very high. Can't hear you.
I'd like to see all the brand still doesn't know when to buy someone.
I've always had a problem with technology and communication. No, I was saying, look, what Boris Johnson is wanting to do, it's Britain versus Europe, it's people versus Parliament, and it's Johnson versus Corbyn. And he was building to this great denouement after the European Council, where he could be able to say that he was fighting a battle against Europe, and Europe was intransigent. He was fighting a battle against Parliament, and they were intransigent, and he was fighting a battle against Corbyn, and he was intransigent, and therefore the election issue was set. Now, because of Ian and others, this has been frustrated in the House of Commons. Because of the courts, it's being frustrated in the courts. But those people who are opposing Johnson have got to watch that some of the, I'm not talking about the court action, but some of the statements that are made will be used by his side to suggest that, yes, they are showing that Parliament's out of touch, they are showing that Europe's out of touch, and they are showing that Corbyn's out of touch. That's how he wants to present this. So you know what he's trying to do. I don't think it's a secret. The question is whether the public will go along with it. And he's got, I mean, the race is on between him trying to win the Brexit vote back, the Brexit party vote back, and those people who support Remain trying to get into a position where they can win every seat that's possible. I mean, I've got no doubt there's going to be an election quite soon, and it's quite clear where these dividing lines are being set by Mr. Cummings or Mr. Johnson. Yeah. And the important thing is that people see through this, that Parliament is not against the people, that Europe is not naturally opposed to Britain, and that you can actually find a relationship with Europe and a relationship between Parliament and the people that is built on trust. Their tactic, which is completely against what Churchill did, is not to unite the country, it is divided as long as there's a certain proportion that they can get and leave the opposition divided amongst themselves. I think that's pretty clear what the tactics are.
So just leave it very quick things, and this is something that's broken tonight, is they do have a plan, because it's broken tonight that various companies connected with senior government advisors and officials have shorted the pound to the tune of £8.3 billion. So they do have some kind of plan. And if you look at the language that people are using at the moment, the Hillary Benn bill, which was to stop no deal, is now called the Surrender Bill. And we've gone from these sunny uplands of the 2016 referendum being wonderful this country to no deal being the option. Now, I'm not sure how we've managed to, how the public and how politicians have managed to make that leap, but it's something we must stop. And Parliament, politicians, lawyers, judges and everyone else will be fighting to make sure we stop that.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that Boris Johnson's more likely to win an election now than the Tories were 6 months ago. And that, honestly, it's not my preference, obviously. It's definitely not the preference of the GMB. But, you know, if you look at the constituencies, and Hope Not Hate have actually done some amazing polling into this. And it was in many seats, actually, some Labour Party politicians kind of assumed that, well, my seat voted 65% leave, therefore it's really important that I reflect the views of my constituents, and they might have been worried about how their constituents for voting. And what it actually turns out from the polling that Hope Not Hate does is that actually you need to look at that a little bit deeper, because the Labour vote in that seat was entirely made up of the Remain vote, right? And it doesn't just coincide that one replicates the other. What Boris Johnson's done is he's after demolishing into the Brexit vote, and that was the most, the rise of the Brexit Party was the thing that's most likely to make him lose a general election. I think he's more poised now than ever. And I think we have to be really realistic about where things are, you know. And we, you know, it's great that we've got a great forum of people here tonight, but you know, we're in danger of also being in a bubble sometimes. And that's why someone asked earlier this evening, what can you do? Go out and have conversations. Those conversations are the transformative conversations. The woman who spoke about the emotional stories she has about her family, emotional stories about who we are is what cuts through campaigns, right? All the time. We look at the whole debate, and I remember working for Hope Not Hate at the time about immigration in this country, and it stopped for one moment, and it was when that photograph of that child showed up on that newspaper, and everyone just drew breath for a little while, because people connect that way. And I know that from the Irish abortion referendum, which I was heavily involved in as well. It was when women came out and started sharing their stories. That's what we need to start doing, because it is emotion that drives people when they go to vote, and that's what we're fighting for at the end of the day.
So, I think we have time for one last question, and there's a lady at the front here.
The lady's getting the mic though, Daniel. I wonder if for the previous gentleman's question, if the Prime Minister comes back with any sort of deal at the 11th hour, should we vote for it? That's your homework, because that's the kind of decisions we're going to have to make, and none of them are palatable. We'd A, have to see what the deal is, and B, see whether or not there is another option out of it. I'll back any deal as long as it goes to a confirmatory vote, would be the way out of it, I would have thought.
It's Boris out.
So can we hear from you?
Taking it back to a couple of questions ago about the voting and whether it should be compulsory. My son lives in Singapore, and when results, or the Brexit results came through, I was actually in Singapore at the time. He has an English wife who was determined to say when it gets to her, I'm part of the country that they were going to vote to remain, and she was shocked to see that it said no, that they're out. Now, out of all the people that came to a party the following day, everybody in Singapore, expats, were all complaining bitterly and were so upset that this result had come through, not to remain. And I started to ask a few of them then, well, what did you vote? The only person out of about 40 people, were all expats, all Brits, some Irish, some Scottish, said no, they hadn't voted. My son was the only one that made the vote. And all I'm asking here is that there's a big wide world out there. You know, can some of your message notes start going out to them? And remember, there's a lot of expats who had the chance to vote and didn't. And they could have made a big difference if we could just get something over to them and engage them in an interest to vote.
So I think there's a couple of very good points in there. You know, first of all, I think making sure that we motivate everyone to vote that can. And then secondly, I think that the global context of what we're looking at is really important. So I think I'll just ask each of the panel members maybe to both answer that question, but also maybe just provide one or two sort of concluding remarks. And I think then Ian will sum up and do the vote of thanks at the end. So Hazel.
Well, I'm not a British citizen, but I did get a vote actually in the EU referendum because I'm Irish. As an Irish citizen, voting as an expat in Ireland is something that I would like to be able to do, and I think that if there are British citizens out there, I don't know actually what the arrangements are for expat voting, but that should definitely be targeted. You know, especially given the huge amount of people we have retired, for example, in Spain, that are British citizens, that should be voting in the EU referendum. I would be in agreement with that.
Elaine, do you have any thoughts or concluding remarks?
I suppose I just want to say a human story to link in with that. I know that my younger daughter when the result came out that morning, was in tears and distraught at the result. And she was most distraught about the fact that a number of her friends simply didn't bother to vote. And she had spoken to them afterwards and they regretted not doing it. So again, it's a message of having the conversation. And I think back to the independence referendum. I can remember talking to people in the stores. People were actively debating it. There was a huge interest and discussion about it. And that's what we need to have again in a really informed way and get the people out there.
Well, thank you very much, Diane. Just as a very brief summing up on that point, I was in Chicago back in May on a parliamentary delegation, and the new Democratic congressman for the 6th district in Chicago had won the seat for the first time from the Republicans. And we met in his office just to chat about some of the issues. And as I walked into his office and gave my hand to shake, he said, "Thank you very much indeed for making sure that the United States isn't the laughing stock of the world." And I think that probably sums up where we are. Look, thank you very much indeed. I'm just saying a few words of thanks, so if you will join me in your appreciation. Firstly, to everyone here at the Churchill Theatre who treat us so wonderfully well. So thank you very much indeed for them. Also to Daniel and I's team of staff who actually do all of this. We just sort of give the instructions, turn up, waffle and go home. So thank you very, very much to my team of staff, Leslie, Emma and Lewis, and also to Michael and the new member of staff who I've not met yet. You're going to tell me what his name is, Alan. So thank you very much to them for putting all this together. To our panel, we are so blessed to be able to put a panel together of such wonderful experts. We don't often get former Prime Ministers, we don't often get the senior members of the GMB who are creating jobs and holding industry together in this country. We certainly don't often get the person who's just about to bring Boris Johnson's government to its knees. Or fifth, packed out. Nobody else can get a ticket for this evening event that Diane and I have done on Brexit. I hope it's been worthwhile. And let me just finish with this. As I said at the start, we haven't left yet. I have no intention of us leaving the European Union. Myself and my colleagues will be working night and day to ensure that doesn't happen. With your support, we're able to do that. So thank you very much indeed for coming, and please keep in touch with us. Thank you very much indeed.
Can't steer it.